Steve Lillywhite is a legendary record producer. When he worked with Siouxsie and the Banshees, it provided his first hit record as a producer, Hong Kong Garden. And that opened the floodgates with artists wanting to work with him. His list of artists reads like a who's who of popular music, from new wave acts like XTC to Simple Minds, and his longest collaboration with U2. He's a fascinating man with a clear understanding of his craft and what he offers.
So I've worked with them from 1979 to 2024. My 10,000 hours were nothing to do with my eyes, and it was all to do with my ears. It wasn't I was looking for the sound that I wanted. What I did was I rejected all the sounds that I didn't like. If someone says, Steve, what's the most important thing? For me, it's enthusiasm. You know, it's not talent. I see everything as art. The only way to know timeless art is when time has happened.
Don't go away. The interview with Steve Lillywhite starts in seconds. But as usual, just time for me to ask you to like, subscribe, and if you would, become a member. That support helps me continue this podcast. And also, please don't forget to look out for other interviews at popthehistorymakers.com. Steve Lillywhite, welcome. Where do we find you?
Oh, I am on the island of the gods, as it's called, and it's called Bali, and it's part of Indonesia. And I've lived in Indonesia for the last 10 years. I came over here to do a couple of tracks with to produce one of the biggest bands in Indonesia. I had this inkling towards Asia, and I was living in California. I was living in LA, and I was seeing, you know, everyone's career sort of is, you know, I've been lucky. I've had ups and downs, but I've hung in there. And I just felt that living in LA, my enthusiasm was not as good. And I went all around Southeast Asia, and, you know, I didn't like Thailand because I didn't like how the voices sounded, you know, and I was invited to come to Indonesia to record a big band here. And I did 3 songs with them, and I saw them, how they sort of devoured CDs and things like that over here. And I went, oh my God, there is still a love of music that is 10 years behind where we are in the West, you know. And so I thought, well, I did my 3 tracks with this band, and I thought, well, I'll stay for another few weeks. And then I was in Jakarta, which is just a city, you know. I was in Jakarta for 7 years. And then I thought, well, I like this country. I bought some land in Bali, and I bought the imaginatively titled, well, I named it the Lily Pad, okay, which I thought was pretty good. I thought it was pretty good.
Well, I'm in the Blame Pad, which is in Athens in Greece. And it's interesting you talk about Bali in that way, because I've always been in love with Greece. So I always wanted to come here one day and live here. And now I'm here, I'm really discovering like the contemporary culture.
I think you're probably like me, when some people move to a country and they just live in a bubble of expats. I am not like that. I like to get myself involved in the local arts, you know, and in fact, I have a job here where we can talk about that later, but I know, you know, it's funny, in the last 10 years, I now know all the big bands, all the gossip about Indonesia. It's the 4th largest country in the world, but it's in general, when you say Indonesia, people don't have, like, if you say Vietnam, you go war. If you say Thailand, you go sex. If you go Indonesia, you go coffee, maybe Java. There's not like a catchword that goes with Indonesia, you know.
Okay, I mean, there are some similarities. Maybe we can talk about it later, but I just want to take you back to your own childhood and really just start with what sort of music you were brought up around. What sort of music did your parents play?
Operatic. I remember South Pacific. I remember, you know, my mum was in, you know, she did, in the choir and stuff like that. But it wasn't that huge. It wasn't that important. And I was honestly not even considered, and I never considered myself as being anything like, oh, I'm going to be like very well known as a music producer. I was useless at school. I didn't go to college. I left school at 16, but I was very lucky that I got a job in a recording studio. So
before we get onto that, I just want to ask you, because music for me was an escape in my childhood. Do you know what I mean? Sometimes I'd go in my room and I'd play, I don't know. I mean, by the time I was 13, obviously Bowie was the thing. I was that generation. And Bowie, for me, because I was a gay kid, he sort of provided a safe space. Do you know what I mean? So that was really important to me. And I just wonder what music provided for you.
Oh, well, for me weirdly, my very first love, you were either an Enemy, Sounds, or Melody Maker reader. They crossed over, obviously, but if you were into Enemy, you're a bit more into slightly sort of alternative. If you're into Sounds, you're into more heavy metal. And if you're into Melody Maker, you like the blues. So I used to read Melody Maker. That was my one. So I used to go to the Melody Maker Blues Festival at Royal Albert Hall. So I saw John Lee Hooker and I saw all these. And that sort of then developed into a love of very bad prog rock. But also if I threw a few band names out to you, I mean, there was a band called Egg, who I loved, which the guy Dave Stewart was, not that Dave Stewart, but another one. I loved them. I loved a band called Quintessence. I loved a band called Comus. I loved Stack Ridge, and I loved 10 Years After as well. They were probably because I was a bass player. And I loved the fact of how fast they all played, So I like that. So, but David Bowie, Hunky Dory was my album. That was when I started to sort of think, oh my God, I love this. And I was at that, sexually, we were all in love with David Bowie. It didn't matter if you were a straight kid or a gay kid. David Bowie was this androgynous, wonderful being that we all loved. And and for me, Hunky Dory was, and I went back and I did some analysis of Hunky Dory compared to Ziggy Stardust. For me, Hunky Dory is a million times better than Ziggy Stardust. Ziggy Stardust has elements of pub rock, which for me is the worst thing you could ever describe a band.
So what's Hunky Dory? Because it's very atmospheric, Hunky Dory.
And it's very whimsical, and it's got these wonderful arrangements, and Rick Wakeman was brilliant in it. So, it was, that was, David Bowie, but we all come from a very, from that David Bowie and the Beatles, the Beatles when I was very young, David Bowie when I was developing my own taste.
But he was an educator, wasn't he? Because it was when you looked at, I mean, you talked about the Melody Maker, and they were also writing about the background of what Bowie was influenced by. And then you realize that there was far deeper than just, someone making music. It had far deeper themes and stuff in it.
Yeah. I mean, fast forward decades, and I was his A&R man. And when I had a corporate job in America at Columbia Records, and I was told to go and hang out with David Bowie to try and get him to make a new album, and I went and I sat down with him, and it was, normally when I meet my heroes, I'm impressed with them, I mean, Joe Strummer was fucking brilliant, when I used to hang out with him, but David Bowie, he was, I don't know if I was expecting too much, but he was just too normal. And we were talking, and I knew that he wasn't really interested in making an album when, he was talking about U2, and he said his favorite U2 album was Zooropa, which was like a very left field, not, and I thought, well, no, he doesn't really want to make a record at the time. So I failed in my quest but he was lovely. He was very nice, but I wanted that. And I wanted the man I fell in love with when I was 16, 15.
You said, when you were at school, you weren't any good. Were you an outsider?
Yes. With a name like Lillywhite, you cannot be a tough guy. So I was considered, if there was, at the time when it was like the worst thing in the world to be gay, it was questioned, like, you have a name like Lillywhite, you're probably a homosexual. And I wasn't, but and the fact that I loved David Bowie until I got a guitar. And when I got a guitar, I joined a local band, and all of a sudden, I was never in the cool gang, but all of a sudden I was accepted by the cool gang, because I was in a band. And then I got kicked out of school. I didn't even do A levels. I did O levels. I got 4 O levels, not enough to get into the sixth form. So I did another year of fifth form. And by the end of that, I was into smoking weed and, and everything like that. Well, not weed, very bad hashish. But I then decided, I was lucky and I got a job in a recording studio. So I did my 10,000 hours from the age of sort of 17 to the age of 22. So even though 22 to us now seems like really young, by the time I started my production career, I'd done the 10,000 hours. And therefore I had this ability to be in a recording studio, which still in those days, recording studios were like the mixture of the TARDIS and Star Trek. They were not, there were places that you needed someone to make you feel comfortable in if you were an artist. And I'd done that. So I could actually look after artists in a studio. And I'm not the alpha male in anything in my life. Put me in a recording studio and I am basically the alpha male. I sort of acquire this persona of knowing how to steer something to the right place. And that's only because I had all that experience when I was very young, pressing buttons in the control room,
That's interesting because, what I've heard and I've seen interviews with you talk about this, that you were sort of isolated between 2 rooms and you didn't have a voice in that period. So you had to take it all in.
Yeah, so my 10,000 hours were nothing to do with my eyes, and it was all to do with my ears, because all I could do was listen to what they were doing. And you'll probably hear me repeat a few things then if you've seen any other interviews with me. But yeah, you're right. And now, of course, the visual aspect of music is 100% taken over, but I still use my ears. I have, if ever I'm in the studio, I have teams of people who are fantastic at looking at things, but I never look at the screen. I always use my ears, and I'll say blah, blah, blah. And my engineer will look at me and go, no, look, it's there. And I go, I don't care what you're looking at. My ears tell me there's a problem. And actually, I'm right, because sometimes when you look at something, you imagine that it's okay if it says it's okay. Do you understand what I'm saying? Whereas I've always used my ears as the benchmark of my decision making.
Did you have a mentor in that environment?
I had. Well, the records I was involved in during that point was my engineers at the studio, because it was a corporate record company studio, which didn't need to make a profit. So we were sort of in this sort of bubble of 11 people were employed at this studio. It was crazy. All these engineers, all these technicians who did they all had pens in their pockets. But really the only decent we would do in the mornings, we would do an orchestral session from 10 till 1. So I learned how to mic up orchestras, and that was fun. And then in the afternoon we would get bands in. And really the bands that we had who were any good at that time we did a couple of Status Quo records, but most of the time was Roy Wood doing Wizard. So I've actually been involved in two very big Christmas records. The Wizard one and the Pogues one. But, we did See My Baby Jive and all those Roy Wood records, which were pretty intense because they were complete Phil Spector sound alike, and they took months to make, but that was it. And yeah, so I can't say no. I mean, my mentor was my ears, and which is why my records sort of in those days didn't really sound like anyone else's, because I had my own sort of vision. So I didn't have any sonic mentors as such.
I mean, it's interesting that you say that you had your own vision and you had this training, this 10,000 hours, so to speak. But until you find what your actual sound is, you may have a vision, but you've got to get to that point where that vision comes into operation. How did that process work?
My way of doing it was always reverse. It wasn't I was looking for the sound that I wanted. What I did was I rejected all the sounds that I didn't like until I ended up with something by definition that I could accept. And that was it. I mean, it was looking at it at a different way. It wasn't like I had this vision of how something should sound, but I had pretty strong ideas of if it wasn't how I wanted it to be, I would keep doing it until it became something that was acceptable to me.
You were very young, and even when you started producing, you were still a young man. So
first hit in September 1978, I was 23 and a half.
And that would have been Hong Kong Garden, I presume.
You got it, Steve.
Yeah,
you got it.
I mean, so you have a band come in like Siouxsie and the Banshees. Okay, they weren't a massive band at that point because they're about to become
first ever record.
Yeah, they were, with the Scream, wasn't it? They were about to become.
Yeah, I did. Well, I did Hong Kong Garden on its own because I don't know if you remember, but it was Siouxsie and the Banshees had it in their record contract that they had complete artistic control because they were such a hot property that they could put that in their contract. So they'd actually recorded a version of Hong Kong Garden with some American guy.
Bruce Albertine. Bruce Albertine, yeah. He was into soul music, so it was slightly he was in a different genre,
right.
Really.
Well, the band's thing was that they could reject it, and they did. But their manager Neil Stevenson, I was doing Johnny Thunders album at the time, and Neil's knew Johnny. He came to the studio, heard You Can't Put Your Arms Around a Memory, which is, one of the great song titles, if not one of the great records, and said, I like how this sounds. Do you want to have a go at our single? And I went, fantastic, because I knew, because I was an avid reader of all the music press, that if Siouxsie and the Banshees approved of the recorded version of their first single, then it would be a hit because there was enough momentum to make it a hit. But I had to give them something that, and they were their biggest A&R, they knew what they wanted and what they didn't want. So I went in and did that. And it was, and it still sounds pretty good today.
Well, it's got this original sound that nothing had. And so I just wondered what that process was of what the raw sound that you heard initially and how you took it to this.
Well, yeah, as I say, I took it, but it was not that I ever liked it. It was just, I would try and keep working on it until it was something that I didn't dislike. Weirdly, it was, because then your ego gets involved. And I was very, very, I didn't want my ego to be involved. And this imposter syndrome, because really, for me, all I wanted to do, and once I had a hit, it was like, this is fantastic. I can choose who I want to work with. It wasn't like I've had a hit I'm the big dog, I can do anything now. It was like, wow, I've had a hit. I can keep my standards high, right? And that's what I did. I believed 100% in my artistic thing. You know, if it was a good piece of art, then I would do it and I could make that a hit record.
So this artistic thing, this sound that was specifically yours, whether it's
it was the drum sound. It was
exactly.
like you listen to U2 or Big Country or Simple Minds or any. There was a certain thing that I did, just not because I particularly liked it, but when I tried to do something else, that didn't sound as good as what I was doing like that. You know, that's how I felt.
So bands and artists would hear that sound and say, okay, that's where we want to go. That would be why they would.
But the idea of copying what I'd already done with someone else was also an anathema. It was not, you know, it's not like today where everyone listens to other people's records in the studio and copies things. You know, even if it sounded a little bit like someone else's record, we would discard it because we wanted to, you know, and if a band said to me, Steve, listen to this, I want my drums to sound like that, I would I would say, why don't we invent our own art? Why do you want to sound like someone else? Let's break down the barriers and do something great that we believe in. You know, because the worst thing in the world is having to fucking copy how someone else does it. And you never do it as well, because there's so many different things that make a record unique. I don't know how they go to make their sound, you know, but I'm interested in the journey that me and you can take to make something great.
What you said about Siouxsie and the Banshees.
Basically, a children's. I'm like a Blue Peter presenter, Steve. That's all I am. There we go. We'll just get some sticky back plastic. We'll get this and that, and we'll make a record.
What you said about Siouxsie and the Banshees, and that you knew that if something good came out of that would be, you know, a successful record. What else? What sort of research goes into working with a band? Do you go with a blank page, or do you go with knowledge about everything they've been involved in?
Oh, God, I produced the Rolling Stones and I did not listen to one Rolling Stones record before I went in there. No, I was terrible. I never did my homework at school. And but I've got this, you know, I'm not religious, but I do believe that magic can happen given the right combination of things. And that's how now you can put the best band in the best studio with the best producer with the best equipment and you can come out with shit. And you know, I've made the best records in the worst studios and the worst records in the best studios. There is something of the unknown that I am really attracted to, and that unknown comes from not being so rehearsed that you take out all the chance from a record. I like that idea of the chance of it either being shit or it being great. And by hard work and enthusiasm and diligence, we can make it great. I mean, you see, that's the difference. That's the difference between a job and a vocation.
You mentioned about going in with a lack of ego, but you're going into often egos. You mentioned the Rolling Stones, of course, you're going into interpersonal relationships, you know, that may not be working that well. So take Rolling Stones for an example. How do you deal when you've got two big egos in the band who seemingly are often at each other's throats?
And on the album that I did with the Rolling Stones, they were completely at each other's throats because Mick had just made his first solo album, which to Keith, that's like being unfaithful. You know, that was completely his way of looking at things. But no, my job with the Rolling Stones was as much Henry Kissinger as anything. You know, I would have Mick go, blah, 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 you tell him this, and I go to Keith, blah, 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 so they were hardly ever in the studio at the same time, so it was, but I learned a lot from them. I learned how a great band could be, because very occasionally they would be, but then it just fell apart again.
One band you've worked with many times over the years is, of course, U2. Yeah. When you first encountered them, what was your impression, and what did you feel that they lacked that you could bring? More of Steve coming up, and of course he'll be talking about U2 and more. But as usual, it's time for me to ask you to like, subscribe, become a member, and support me in keeping this podcast going. And don't forget, look out for the other interviews. They're all on the website, popthehistorymakers.com.
I never think anyone lacks anything, otherwise I wouldn't want to do them. That's what I said. Once I had the hit, it becomes a bit like when you're selling your house. If there's only one buyer, they decide how much it costs. If you've got two buyers, then it can go like that. All of a sudden I was known. I'd had a hit, and I wanted to carry on having hits. And I went to see U2 play live. Now, it took 3 albums until we had a hit with U2. Their first hit was New Year's Day, and that was on War. But I did I Will Follow, which, still sounds great today. And as an album, their first album really holds up. I think October, not so well, although October has its place, and it's just, there's not many times you want to listen to it. October's the sort of album you listen to in the winter, sitting next to the fire, because, some things about it are not as rock as U2 ultimately ended up having to be successful. But,
But they weren't only rock, they were completely anthemic at times, weren't they? I mean, they created Sunday Bloody Sunday. They created anthems that will always be there.
Live they were, but on record that's why they went for Brian Eno. That's, they didn't go for Bob Rock, Bob Rock by name, rock by nature. They didn't go for those big rock and roll sounds. And I remember talking to Bryan Adams once about U2, and he said, do you know who would be a brilliant producer for U2? Would be Mutt Lange. And I said that to Edge, and Edge went, really? He does exactly the opposite of what we do. But actually, I think that wouldn't be a bad thing. But anyway, I digress. But yeah, so U2 don't want, the reason they employ Brian Eno is that he hates guitar and drums. So Brian Eno brings things in, that are not a straightforward rock band. Now, I would argue that maybe he's not the best at finishing a record. And that's where my job with U2 sort of changed after producing the first 3 albums. My job was to come in and sort of sort out the difference between, say, what Brian would put in and what the band would put in. And I would try and meld them all together to turn it into a record. But, he's one of the most, he's brilliant, I mean.
What do you think people like Brian Eno learn from you?
I never know. I mean, the great thing about Brian is that he's one of the most intelligent men ever born. I mean, he really is. But he has a unique, pure simplicity to his thinking in the way, I think some people overthink creativity, and what Brian is, he's got this wonderful simpleness of thought, and that is absolutely brilliant. I very good.
I want to get back to this outsider, because you're an outsider at school.
I was with the name Lillywhite, yeah.
Yeah, and an outsider, as we know from Bowie, outsider has played an enormous role in pop music. There's no doubt about it that The Outsider is central to pop music. And there you are, an outsider with lots of other outsiders in a way.
I never felt I'd made it. You know, that's also another thing. You know, I had friends who were much more talented than me, but it's not about talent. It's about lasting the course and again, when it's a vocation, never complain about it, because a job, you're allowed to complain about a job, and you should, because you've got a boss. If I ever complain about what I'm doing, I'm not being true to myself when I first walked into a studio, because I need to have that enthusiasm, Steve, that I had that very first day that I walked in. Otherwise, I will not deliver what I can if I'm on form. You know, my form is down to my ability to and my enthusiasm to make that sticky back plastic stick.
Well, it's also a perfectionism, isn't it? Because you want to reach this point where it works. And if you look at someone like Brian Wilson, his history with his father would be that Brian Wilson would play a piano in another room as a child, and his father would say, "You got that wrong, that's no good." And that's why he became a perfectionist, I feel. And I just wondered whether with you can identify where this drive to
my drive came from fear of flipping burgers, literally, because if I wasn't in a studio and I didn't make money as a producer, I would be working in McDonald's, you know, because I had nothing else to fall back onto. So it was literally the fear, and the fear completely was nothing to do, you know, that overtook the ego. The ego says, "Steve, you've had some hits. These people want to offer you a lot of money. Go and do that record." No, the way I looked at it was, yeah, you know, that band wants me to produce them, but I don't think I could do it. It's not my, you know, I need to find something that I know I can do, you know, and not let my ego be massaged by some guy offering me a lot of money. You know, I turned down so many big bands, not because of, you know, I'm a big guy, but just because, you know, I couldn't have done a good job.
I think that's fascinating because,
you know, I mean, that's the thing. But I did believe that when I chose something to do, I knew if I stayed true to my yeah. So if someone says, "Steve, what's the most important thing?" For me, it's enthusiasm. You know, it's not talent. Loads of people have got talent, but it's the enthusiasm to you know, for instance, when I worked with Big Country, you know, they were quite they'd done a record with Chris Thomas, and all of a sudden they were not as cool. You know, the record company were losing interest a little bit because didn't work with Chris Thomas. So they got me in, and I did a song called Fields of Fire, which, you know, was not particularly commercial really, but we did the one song to try out. And Stuart Adamson, I remember this, he said, "Oh my God, Steve, what I heard last night was so brilliant. What we did, he wrote In a Big Country purely after he heard that, you know, and that for me is the greatest accolade I could ever have, you know, is that I inspired, what I did in the studio inspired someone to go and write their best ever song. You know, it's pretty good.
It's interesting you mentioned Big Country, because there were these three bands, U2, Simple Minds and Big Country, but yet Big Country didn't become the success of the other ones. Do you know why?
I'll tell you exactly why. Certainly in America, they didn't. They had hits in England, but the trouble was the single was the same name as the band. Already you got a little bit of novelty in there. Also, the video for In a Big Country was them driving around on 4x4s, as you probably remember, looking like the Monkees. Also not great. U2, the video for New Year's Day was in the snow. It was like, you know, it worked for the song. in a big country, no, not 4x4s. That didn't work, you know. So it was the people loved the song, and also the fact that the song title and the band's name was the same. I think that, you know, it didn't help anyway.
It's fascinating.
You understand?
Because I completely
sense?
understand. I mean, I was a presenter on MTV. Image came in, once MTV started, Image often started to outweigh the music. So maybe the track couldn't be great, but if the video was amazing, it could sell the record. And it's interesting that you mentioned that.
Stuff like that. Yeah.
So one band you worked with was Steel Pulse, and what fascinated me was this, and obviously, at the time I completely understood why there was this connection between punk and reggae, because there was also the social and political themes were there, and there was a connection between the genres of music. So could you sort of explain how you felt that worked?
Well, it was, I mean, really, my connection with Steel Pulse was much more Chris Blackwell than it was any sort of connection. I mean, the only other thing I did, the members had a song called Offshore Banking Business, which I did, which was the follow-up to Sound of the Suburbs. But with Steel Pulse, it was basically Chris Blackwell signed Steel Pulse and said, Steve, can you go in and cut this single for them, called Ku Klux Klan? And I was in the studio with them, and it really was only like a couple of days of my life. So it was not, I didn't do the album or anything like that. And I was, and we had, my engineer was a guy from Island Records who was the black guy as well. So you had everyone on the team was the band and the engineer were all black, and I was the only white guy in there. And of course, the spliffs kept coming. And I suddenly at one point was going, oh, my God. So I took my engineer to the side. I said, is it okay for me to be here? It's like, oh, man, Steve, you're doing a great job. And he talked me down to because I was suddenly got this thing of oh, my God, I don't know, middle class white boy. I don't know if I'm able to do this, but it was great. I was really given the thing, and it turned out well, but I never saw them after that day. And, it's not something that I really, I'm surprised you mentioned it,
Well, I love the track. I mean, Ku Klux Klan was just a track that I completely loved. So I wanted to go there. But with you two, you've accompanied them on, and I hate this word, but you've accompanied them on their sort of journey and progression through music with a band like Simple Minds.
Right up till last year when I worked with them at the Sphere. So I've worked with them from 1979 to 2024.
And
45 years.
Wow. And with them and a band like Simple Minds, you've been at a sort of pivotal moment.
My favorite Simple Minds album of all time was New Gold Dream. I absolutely loved that album. It had, Promised You a Miracle. Fantastic. The album I did had Waterfront. It had Up on the Catwalk. It was a good album, but it was very intense. Sonically.
Is that when Mel Gaynor was in at that point?
Yeah, Mel Gaynor was. Yeah, he was the new drummer.
That's where they became a stadium band, wasn't it? This is where the movement there.
Yeah.
But were you aware of this progression with them at that point then?
Yeah. Well, the drummer they had before was not as sort of meat and potatoes as Mel. But Mel is meat and potatoes as well as being Mr. Fancy Pants. So he gives you power and he gives you paradiddles. I mean, he was really good at that. Whereas the drummer before was not quite as, Mel had a reputation as a sort of session player before he joined Simple Minds. So, it was very good. And the secret weapon for me with Simple Minds was always Derek Forbes, the bass player, because he, you Promised You a Miracle just is led by the bass line. Dun, 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 promised you, and it was like a lead bass, because Charlie Burchill, the guitar player, was never Keith Richards or never The Edge. He was dancing around in the background. And the main thing on Simple Minds was the bass line. And when he left the band, I think they pretty much lost their mojo, their uniqueness, you know. And that wasn't that long. He did another album, I think, after Sparkle in the Rain. But that was the thing. And I really thought I might do another album with Simple Minds, and they never asked me again. And subsequently, I've seen interviews with Jim Kerr where he's not been nasty to me, but it's like, well, you know, Steve Lillywhite didn't push us with our songwriting. Well, you know, maybe that's not my job pushing you for your songwriting. Maybe it is. But anyway, I digress.
Well, no, I mean, everyone has different perspectives of situations, don't we? So it's
and different producers do different jobs. It's like, well, you know, I'm not a songwriter. I'll help as much as I can, but I never consider, you know, I want to be a great producer. You can't be a great producer and a great songwriter. You know, I mean, for me anyway, I have to do as little as possible. So I managed to get it right. You
mentioned the 2 Christmas hits that you'd been involved with, the Wizard Roy Wood, and of course, you know, probably the greatest Christmas song.
I would like to think so, wouldn't you, Steve?
Ever written, yeah.
So you've probably got a liking for Mariah fucking Carey, don't you?
I've got a soft spot for Wham, to be honest.
Oh, well, yeah, that's a gay thing, though. That's a gay thing.
Yeah, probably, exactly. But Fairy Tale of New York.
You know what? I have a soft spot for that Wham song. I saw the documentary at Christmas, and it was, you know, when they all went back to the chalet where they made the video, and George was brilliant. You know, I knew George before he made a record, because my best friend produced Wham, a guy called Steve Brown. And I mean, I went to school with Steve. We were the 2 Steves. He was my best friend, and he's sadly not with us. But he did Wham in those early days. And you know, so I knew George. And even up to the point when George was possibly the biggest solo artist in the world, that was for about a 6-month period. You know, and then arguably Prince or Michael Jackson retook that crown. But even when he was that big, if I saw him at a party, he would look at me and go, Steve, and he'd leave he would always come over and say hi. He was, you know, and he loved that whole sense of family. And that documentary on the Christmas song, really, you know, it was just, he took all his mates over. And he surrounded himself with his friends, and you know, it was so sad. And Elton really was wanting to get him sober, you know, and never happened. And it was sad that he left so early.
Yeah, and I think it's, you know, in retrospect, how we look back at someone and their talent is sometimes different, and it's the true perspective of what they were. And if I look at George Michael today, just incredible body of work.
Well, that's the definition of, I see everything as art, but you know, the only way to know timeless art is when time has happened, you know. And you know, we didn't know that Fairy Tale of New York, for instance, would be, well, you know, when we made it, it was a good song, but you know, it is a timeless piece of art. But you don't know that until time has proven it or disproven it, you know. So that's what we all try and make, because people who make records, for me, that's what I try and do. I try and make timeless art. You don't ever succeed 100% of the time, but you know, I like to try to think that I've had a couple anyway that have done that.
I mean, the combination in that song, obviously Shane MacGowan and his, I don't know what to call it really, but his obvious problems that he's had in his life. And then you've got a personal relationship with Kirsty MacColl, and I don't know if you were together with her at that point or later on.
Oh, yes. We were married. We had 2 small children. In 1985, we'd only got married. Now, when was Fairy Tale? Was 87, maybe. We'd been married. We got married in 85 and 84, actually. And so, yeah, we were very much in love, and you know, I basically, you know, but it wasn't definite that Kirsty was going to be the virgin. They had higher hopes. They really wanted Chrissie Hynde, you know, or someone, because Kirsty was not, you know, she'd had she'd had New England, she'd had Chip Shop, you know, but those are not sort of a body of work like Chrissy had, you know, so they wanted someone big. So, but, you know, I remember even now when I finished doing Kirsty's vocal, because obviously she did her voice to his voice, they never sung together. And I took it in on the Monday morning after I'd done it over the weekend. They listened to it and they went, oh my God, that is brilliant. And it really is. I've heard many, many versions of that song, but I've never heard anyone sing the female part close to how Kirsty does, because it's much more difficult than you think. All the little swing and all those little nuances on the vocal, you can sing it badly and it sounds, they've got cars big as bars, they've got rivers of got, you know, that is really square. The way Kirsty does it, she bounces off the rhythm and it's just perfect, you know.
And there's a purity to her voice, isn't there? There's an immense purity. She was one of the greats, really. I mean, you know, the only problem with her career is that she never ever followed a hit with a hit. So she never toured until towards the end of her life. So she never acquired a bigger and a bigger and a bigger following. She would do well, she'd have the hit, then it would go flat again. And then the next one, the follow-up, it should have like pushed it one step higher, but the follow-up was never a hit. You know, she had a beautiful song called Free World that got to number 41. As you know, number 41 is the worst possible chart position you can ever get to because you don't get top of the pops, you know. Your career, well, it started in the late 70s and obviously developed through the 80s. When you think of most artists, and I remember when at MTV, we did a bit of research on the longevity of artists, and we came up with that most artists have a sort of 4-year cycle of success. I mean, it's unusual to have a longer success. And I presume it's the same for producers. Producers don't...
A little bit. Okay. With a band... talking back in those days, you can have a hit single, so therefore you have a hit album, and then the next one, if it's not a hit, maybe you get to do a third one, like you know, but in general, you know, it starts to fall away for an artist. A producer can live off their fucking number one single for 6 or 7 years, you know, because you get very good with the old gift of the gab, talking about that great record that you've done, you know, but you never you bury your dead. It's like A&R men. They bury their dead very well. They never talk about the ones that they never had success with. You know, artists are completely in the spotlight. There's no way they can hide their miss. You know, producers can hide their miss a certain amount of times. A&R men are the scourge of the earth.
What do you think embodies the perfectly produced song, and what is, in your opinion, the most perfectly produced song?
Oh my God, what embodies the the ability to keep discovering different things in the song, you know, keep discovering different layers. Like, to start with, the first thing you hear on a record is obviously you hear the singing and you hear the melody. Maybe the second thing you hear is the lyrics. The third thing you hear is, oh, I like that guitar riff. Then the fourth thing is like, oh, that drum fill that comes in there. Fucking love that. And then the fifth thing, you keep discovering different things at different layers of a record. And so that's what I like to try and do, because I don't, you know, I mean, I hear a song like "'Cause I'm Happy." I hate that. I loved it when I first heard it, but I could never produce a song like that because I'd want to leave lots of little secret things in there that people, you know, and that's not what that song's all about. You know, so I like songs that keep you interested over multiple listens, because when I'm making it, I listen to it more than anyone, you know. So anyway, that, and what is the most perfectly Oh God, there's so many brilliant records. I mean, Brian Wilson has made some of the greatest, and Brian Wilson did it on his own. He didn't have George Martin or other band members to help. He didn't have, because the great thing about the Beatles was that Paul would write this, so John said, "Fuck you, I'll write that," and then Paul would write that, and then it was brilliant. Brian Wilson was on his own in his sandpit. And you were right when his dad was, goading him, but that's probably the only thing that he had. He was, so, I mean, Surf's Up, absolutely, I love that. But there's so many great, I mean, I don't feel so many great records are being made now, but then I believe that truly great records are combinations of people interacting with each other, sometimes in real time, sometimes not, but it's an interaction thing that you don't get now. I mean, I hear records now and everything is done separately, one thing at a time, and that's great and that's really good, but you listen to Court and Spark by Joni Mitchell, you're just in this room with them and it's just great. That for me is truly great records.
Do you think that the development of technology, and I don't mean just in making music, but how we consume music, has been responsible for I don't want to say a lesser quality, because obviously a younger generation will have their music.
Yeah, because if you don't believe in technology, you're in the Taliban. And we have to believe technology can lead us. I'm not sure where it's leading us at the moment, but we have to believe it can lead the human race to some form of enlightenment. Not being religious, but believing in some magic, because I've experienced magic in a studio that I can't understand why something just happened, but it's my job to grab hold of that magic and make it work. I believe in that magic 100%, and technology is all part of that. Someone is going to take the technology and fuck with it, because that's what it is. All the technology is made by people who are not creative, and then it's the creative people who come along and fuck with it to make art. The trouble is the technology hasn't changed very much in the last 10 years. So you're not getting that sort of outlier, outsider sort of person doing, maybe Billie Eilish does some great stuff. And, there is always music for people, but the ongoing sort of, if you look at the numbers, say for Spotify, as the years go by, the percentage of streaming that is for heritage records, like older records, compared to new records, becomes more and more. Now, when you look at the amount of songs that are uploaded to Spotify on a daily basis, more and more people are just going back to listening to classics, which also makes making new records much more difficult, because you're not just up against the records that are released the same week as you. You're up against the history of music, So, and honestly, Steve, I hear people's new records and I go, what's the point? No one's waiting for the new Coldplay record, let alone your fucking new song. Why don't you just be honest with yourself and put it away and then listen to it in 6 months and go, oh, I like that bit, but I don't like that bit. I'm going to use it. And then, no one's waiting. What I'm saying is no one's waiting for your record, not even for Coldplay's record. So your record, no one's waiting for it. So try and get yourself into this place where you can make that magic happen.
I mean, one thing that I found really interesting at the beginning is that you're now living a different life, and you're encountering new sounds and new creativity. And I said the same thing for me in Greece and hearing a sound that is sometimes very specific to Greece in styles of music that are very universal. And I just wondered what you hear there and what you could tell us about music in Bali in Indonesia.
Indonesia. Well, actually, there's an instrument called a gamelan, which drives me nuts. It's one of those things that you hear, and you're okay hearing it for 15 seconds, and then you realize it just sounds like a load of kids just hitting something with no. I mean, it's just crazy. You know, you can argue that because technology seems to have hit a brick wall, so there's no new technology to be fucked up by creative people. The only way you can get something more new is to take blending of all different styles and age groups. So you take everything, you know, a bit of French music from the 60s with techno from Germany in the 90s, you know, that sort of thing. And then you have the possibility of your unique sound, you know, something unique. And that's good. But I'm not going into the studio anymore. I'm still enthusiastic. And actually, I'm really enjoying listening to music now, which I never did before. You know, when you're making it, you're so in the trenches that I never listened to records. Now I can actually put on records in the evening and I make myself this big playlist, mainly of old stuff, and I put it on shuffle. And I have so many songs in there now that you know, it's fantastic. And do
you include your own songs? The songs that you produce?
There's only two. There's I did a song with you remember World Party, Carl Wallinger. I loved Carl Wallinger, and he's died a couple of years ago now. But I did a song with him called "Is It Like Today," which is a fantastic song about mankind looking at the history and saying, what is life about? It's a fantastic song. So that's on my playlist. And one U2 song called Drowning Man, which just seems to work in my environment. But no, I don't really. I mean, I used to have this thing where I never listened to my own records, but now I listen to, you know, it's okay. And sometimes I listened to the Scream the other day, and there's like one or two tracks which are outstanding, you know, because the Hong Kong Garden wasn't on the screen. It was a decision by the band who had complete artistic control. They didn't want Hong Kong Garden on the album. So sonically, the Scream is much darker. I recorded it in a whole different studio, changed the sounds around, and we got it much darker. But yeah, there's some stunning stuff on that.
Well, Steve Lillywhite, I want to thank you, because I think sometimes there are people that you meet that have made an enormous contribution to popular culture that's been part of your life.
And then they're not so impressive, are they? I'm sorry.
I'll cut that bit out.
No,
I'm joking. I'm joking. No, you're totally impressive. I mean, I think it is amazing that you've had such an impact on popular culture from producing these wonderful artists and actually contributing to their sound that, you know, maybe wouldn't have been there.
A great life. You know, I've honestly really think I've virtually never worked a day in my life, because it goes back to that thing, the difference between a job and a vocation. You know, I see it as a vocation, but because it's a vocation, I must never complain about it.
Up there is an interview I recommend. Down there is where you can find all the podcast interviews. And here is where you can connect.